You're listening to Big World Network.
Average, Season 1, Episode 11. Written by Jonathan Thompson, read by Heather Thompson. Awkward as it was, dinner was enlightening. Well, not so much the dinner itself, but the conversation I was forced into afterward was enlightening. Life-changing, even. The dinner was just plain awkward. Gail and Vinny talked about work with my father, with James interjecting where he could. It always amazed me how my dad could still be so interesting even while hiding the most interesting part of himself. Only playing the role of your friendly neighborhood plumber, George Pierce, was incredibly fascinating. He saw these people at least once a week, but he always had fresh stories for them. That night, he was describing a house that he had worked in where the homeowner had spent years collecting taxidermied animals with the ultimate goal of creating a massive diorama displaying the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock was played by a very distinguished-looking otter. I watched him tell the story and wondered if it ever frustrated him not to be able to tell his real stories. Actually, I realized then he never even told his real stories to me. He never shared anything about his heroing when he came home at night. I didn't even know who his nemesis was. And that's messed up. If there's one thing the son of a superhero should know, it's the name of his father's archenemy. I made a mental note to ask him about that. In the meantime, Mike and Cosmo were playing a rousing game of Trust Me, I Know, which was one of Mike's favorite ways to pass the time. Cosmo was, by his own standards, a jack of all trades and an expert on just about everything. At varying points in his life, Cosmo had claimed to be an award-winning poet, a professional boxer, a licensed barber, and, of course, a chef. No one ever saw any concrete proof to support any of his claims, but we also had no real way to disprove it. So Cosmo became this sort of vague, legendary figure in our lives, with no one really knowing what to believe about him. Mike chose to believe everything Cosmo said was a lie, and that each one was more hilarious than the last. He collected them. And this is how Trust Me, I Know was born. The game was simple. Mike would begin the conversation by mentioning his own budding interest in a number of topics. Cosmo would counter by describing his own experience and expertise, strengthening his case by asserting, Trust me, I know. The round began with woodworking, and by the end of the evening, we learned that Cosmo was indirectly responsible for inventing the modern violin-style bass guitar, had made his own cheese for years that had a cult following, and at one point flew seaplanes over the Long Island Sound. But that night, something was different than usual. Most times, I would only half listen to this back and forth, silently amused, while trying to either pay attention to my dad or get attention from Grace. For some reason, I felt like testing the waters. Maybe it was just because Cosmo had been so unusually aggressive before dinner, but I had a weird thought. What if Cosmo is a mind reader? It would explain his above-average intuition and overactive paranoid delusions. It would also account for his responses to me all night, so fitfully defending his chicken. Have you ever tried to yell at someone with your mind? Admit it, you have. At some point in your life, you narrowed your eyes and focused until your head hurt and tried to think into someone else's brain. That's how I spent my evening. At first, I tried to repeat what had already worked. I insulted his food, mentally, which wasn't hard. That was totally jarred sauce. I don't care what he said. But I got nothing. He was too involved with this conversation. Or he was just choosing to ignore me. Either way, he didn't respond. So I kept at it. Eventually, I ran out of ideas and just started yelling, Cosmo! Hey! Cosmo! You'd be surprised how difficult it is to improvise an inner monologue for a suspected audience. At one point, he paused. My heart stopped. He sat still for a second, obviously bothered by something. Achoo! He let loose a monstrous sneeze and kept right on talking. After an untold length of time trying to annoy Cosmo into revealing himself, my head started to hurt. Right around that time, I heard my dad say, So that's why I always carry an extra pair of socks. I had to know what that story was. Plus, Cosmo had left the room to go make coffee, so I gave up for the time being. But I still wasn't convinced that I had been wrong. Like everything about Cosmo, there was still just enough to doubt. After dinner, though, all of my doubt was done away with. Cosmo and I were the only people there who didn't drink coffee. Well, neither did Grace, but she also didn't move from the table. Even Mike, who usually favored such delicate or just outright bland flavors, was a bit of an addict. After setting the pot and a few cups down on the table next to the sugar and powdered creamer that were fixtures there, Cosmo retired into the living room like he always did. I held my ground at the table for a few minutes, but then Il Duce beckoned. "Quinn, get in here!" I didn't move. All of a sudden, I was the center of the group's attention. All night, no one had noticed me, but now they were all suddenly concerned with where I chose to sit. Dad signaled with a nod that I should obey, so I reluctantly did. I looked pitifully, pleading at Grace as I walked past her. "Have fun," she smiled. The living room was a small room, surrounded on all four walls by shelves that contained hundreds of books and even more worthless knickknacks. Even though Vinny and Gail shared the house with Cosmo, this room was his den, his lair. This was where he dragged his prey before feasting. He was in his chair, a large, puffy, tattered recliner with a book already in his lap. "Give me a break," I thought. "You've been here for 2 seconds. I know you're not actually reading." He looked at me and smiled, holding the book up so I could see what it was. Selected Poems by Frost. "One of my favorites," he said. He set the book aside and leaned forward, clasping his hands together like a Bond villain. Thankfully, he didn't own a cat. "So I heard about what happened with that character at your school the other day," he began, but he stopped there. Cosmo had this way of trying to lead you into a conversation by only offering a part of a sentence. I had a way of refusing to play that game and waiting in silence for him to get to his point. "How'd you beat him? I mean, he had superpowers, right?" I shrugged. "I just sort of figured out how his power worked and used it against him." "You mean like how you figured out my power?" he asked.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.